On April 25th, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake devastated the lives of people living in Nepal and ravaged the landscape of Kathmandu. To date, CNN News reported more than 8,500 dead following the initial quake and subsequent aftershocks. Welcome to xConnect Northwest. I'm your host, Greg Mills. On this episode of xConnect Northwest, we're talking earthquakes. Now, before we get going, just a reminder that you at home can join in with the conversation. Just connect with us on Twitter at NWPTV. You can use hashtag xConnectNorthwest on Facebook, search Northwest Public Television, or by email, kwsutv@wsu.edu. Now, last week I spoke with Richard Briggs of the USGS. He told me how the earthquake in Nepal impacted more than just that region.
So at the National Earthquake Information Center, there's multiple layers of this, and they happen in from minutes to days. The first thing that happens is we figure out where and how big the earthquake was. The next step is if it was a big one, like in Nepal, right away there's a series of products that come out that figure out how big was the shaking, how large was the shaking, and where was it, and then translates that into an assessment of the risk. In other words, the lives and the money that were impacted. Now in Nepal, this was, in some ways, a really important event for people in the Pacific Northwest because it's the kind of earthquake that happens where one plate is colliding with another plate and slipping underneath. And so in Nepal, it's India colliding with Asia, and in the Pacific Northwest, it's the Pacific plate going underneath North America. But the end result is the same. It stores strain for quite a long time and then suddenly slips. And so we're learning some things about how slip happens on these kinds of low-angle thrusts by looking at Nepal that maybe help us understand subduction systems like in the Pacific Northwest.
Today I'm joined by Catherine Cooper, professor of geology and geophysics at Washington State University. Katie, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate having
Thanks
you
for
take
having
the
me.
time. Yeah, it's great. All right, tell me a little bit about the role of geologists and geophysicists and what it's all about. Let's just get the whole thing out there.
Sure. Well, I'd have to say, like, the primary role is that we study and want to understand how the Earth is operating. And that can go from something as a large planetary scale, which is what I do, to then looking at what's happening along plate boundaries and when earthquakes happen, what happens after they happen, helping build hazard maps, so on and so forth. So we do kind of have a very large, all-encompassing field within that, and some people do then focus in on earthquake seismology.
Yeah, and as we heard Richard talk a little bit about some of what's really happening with an earthquake, how can you help shape that picture and describe what's really happening when an earthquake occurs?
Sure. So the majority of earthquakes that happen are happening along plate boundaries. So this is our surface of our Earth is divided up into different plates, and each of these plates has a certain velocity and movement associated with it. And as they meet another plate, then of course you're going to end up with some forces against each other. Along those plate boundaries, again, is where we have primarily majority of our earthquakes. Sometimes we have them off of plate boundaries, but most times they happen on the plate boundaries. And that is what happened within the Nepal earthquake. So we're having this continual motion and grinding against each other of these plates. And that can't be sustained by two, essentially, then planes of rock. Eventually that will then rupture, and it will rupture in a very catastrophic manner, which then is the earthquake.
And what are some of the obvious dangers for people and plants and animals too, I suppose, with earthquakes?
Certainly you have kind of the first order dangers that's coming from the shaking itself. I read that most injuries happen because things have fallen on you. The shaking will also cause instability within your buildings. You can also then end up with secondary kind of disasters where you end up with gas lines rupturing and then you have fires happening. Landslides can also occur. You can, now I'm blinking on things too, but those are kind of the primary things that we worry about.
Sure, yeah, and that makes complete sense. And I know I've heard, and of course that's, I think, with a lot of people, kind of the way it is with earthquakes, we really don't have a lot of experience with them. We talk about them a little bit in school, or somebody, of course, like you or in course of study that you're involved with, you'd know a lot more, but aftershocks may be more of a problem than the initial quake itself. I think sometimes we get that backward. Am I right about that?
That's really hard to say, and it is also hard to pinpoint as to when you're going to have aftershocks, how often do they happen, and are they associated with every single earthquake? Yeah. That may not necessarily be the case. For this one, it was really unfortunate that a lot of the aftershocks ended up being incredibly large. Yeah. And so it is hard to, then to pinpoint and say, okay, if you had an earthquake of this size, then you're going to have aftershocks of this size. That's something that we don't necessarily know. A lot of the issue too is then once you've had that big earthquake, you know the aftershocks are coming, but then you're also kind of lulled into like a little bit of false sense of security. Mm-hmm. Because again, you could have an aftershock that is almost as big as the first one.
Yeah, can we predict them with any accuracy or any great accuracy? I know you do have accuracy.
No, unfortunately, and I think this is the biggest struggle probably for earthquake seismologists is their inability to accurately predict earthquakes. And I don't even know if that would be their end game completely as well. Really more of understanding what are the consequences.
Yeah, and I understand what you mean. I started thinking about that too, about whether or not that was the end game, about actually predicting them and trying to put some sort of a date on it. But you can really see some things happening seismically, right? Before something's going to happen, or
no, not exactly.
You can't. Okay.
The best thing that you can do, and this is something that USGS has done really well of, is building kind of early detection. And so then when earthquakes happen, they release a number of different types of waves.
Okay.
And the waves that are doing the destruction, they come in later than these early waves that are primary waves. And so you could see those come in, and you might then be able to give somebody seconds to prepare, but well, that can actually help save lives because that gives you seconds to then duck and cover and get underneath something. Yeah. And so, that is incredibly powerful that they can even do that. But if you can say, oh man, we look like we're in earthquake season, that's not a thing.
It just doesn't make any sense. You talked about it a little bit, but what really happened in Nepal?
The story starts back like 40 million years ago, where we had India colliding with Asia, which then, we got the amazing Himalayan mountains from it. But that does also mean that we have a very active, again, plate boundary. And this collision is still occurring. And it's occurring, and there's a lot of debate on whether or not the Himalayas are growing still, or are they reached their maximum height. But that constant grinding is still happening there. And so there's a main kind of thrust of India going underneath Asia. And the rupture happened along that main thrust.
Can we have something of that magnitude in the Pacific Northwest?
Certainly.
Yeah?
Yeah, along the kind of Washington-Oregon border, right in the Cascadia Range. We do have a similar kind of scenario where we have one plate butting up against another plate. The Wanda-Fuchta plate, which is offshore of Washington and Oregon, is directly going underneath the North American plate. There have been large earthquakes and even larger along that subduction zone in the past. There's been one of magnitude 9 back in 1700. And generated a very large tsunami that then caused devastation in Japan. So we know that historically that this has happened, and we know that theoretically it's going to happen again.
We just don't know when.
We just don't know when.
And I suppose in part where, you think much more largely in where, as thinking of plates and continents and that sort of thing, but the rest of us, of course, think in where as where we are.
Right, exactly. And I think it's safe to say the Oregon-Washington border.
Because I remember back, it was circa 2000 or so, somewhere in that, 99, 2000, that I remember feeling, earthquakes in Spokane. Mm-hmm. And where does that, they obviously were nowhere near any of these devastating earthquakes, but where do they fit in the scale of things, and what function do they serve?
That is actually an excellent question of where do the smaller earthquakes fit into the larger kind of earthquake cycle. And that's something that we don't completely know yet. We also have another interesting phenomenon in the Cascadian subduction zone where we have what's known as slow quakes, where these are happening over a month-long period of where we do see movement along the fault, but it's not something that we would feel in our every day-to-day life. But we're picking it up in GPS sensors. And so how that ties in is that, are those releasing enough energy then to keep us safe for a large one? I don't think that scientists really have a handle on that, but I think that they still say, no, this is capable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake, so we still have to like maintain that precaution.
Yeah. So when we think about, and I was thinking about that too, is it relieving any sort of pressure or tension when there are earthquakes, even certainly of the magnitude of the one that occurred in Nepal? Do you feel some sort of relief, or does it feel like it's leading you toward more of that? I don't know how to think about that.
Yeah, I don't think necessarily we know completely how to think about that yet either. Part of that comes from, if you think about how old the Earth is and how long plate tectonics has been operating, so we're looking at billions of years of a range scale, where how long we've actually been recording earthquakes, which is only a couple hundred of years, our data sampling is pretty puny. And so that ties up things. I mean, granted, we have like a lot of theoretical insight into what we think is happening along an earthquake cycle, but it's really hard to say.
Yeah, have we, do we prepare very well for earthquakes as human beings, as United States citizens maybe to start with, and then maybe as human beings secondly?
I think we're getting a lot better at it. I know the U.S. has an incredible push to make people prepared. They have the Shakeout Day, which happens every year in October, where you can go and say you want to be a participant of the Shakeout. And what happens is this is a drill, and you act like an earthquake happens at this certain time, and you get underneath your desk and you hold on and you do everything that you would do in an actual earthquake event. And again, this is a nationwide effort. And I know that we are trying to like push globally too, to be more prepared about this as well.
And do we feel like that's happening, or is it kind of slow to grab onto, or where does it fit?
I think some areas we are very good about it. California rocks at this. They do an amazing job at this. Some of the other areas are not as great. I do know that there are several people that I've known that participated in Seattle. I don't think it would be a bad thing to do on the eastern side of the state, and particularly on campus, so that way students, when they move back to the west side, they're also prepared.
Yeah. Do you have information that's accessible from the department that you work with at Washington State University that people could get information from, or is that something that's just with your classes?
I talk about it in my classes. Almost every class I do mention this is what you need to do to be prepared, and I ask exam questions about it as well, because I think it's that important.
Sure.
We don't have necessarily a direct link on our website yet. Our website's being revamped right now, so a lot of things are not on our website.
Right.
But I think that's a great one to put on there. But if you just went and looked on USGS and looked for Shakeout, you would find it pop up.
Thanks a lot. So much to think about, so much to talk about. Thanks for coming and being here today.
Thanks.
I'd like to thank Richard Briggs and Catherine Cooper for joining us today, and thank you at home for helping us out. Hope you enjoyed today's show. Remember, you can stay connected with us all week. You can tweet us, like us on Facebook, add us to your circle on Google+, or email us at kwsutv@wsu.edu and send us your show ideas. If you missed any part of today's show, don't worry. All of it will be available online at nwptv.org. Next time on xConnect Northwest, Cornell Clayton and Sam Reed will join us live from Pullman to talk about the Foley Institute. If you have questions, feel free to connect with us online. I'm Greg Mills. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on air and online.